but it's actually a very misleading distinction. So as soon as we actually start looking at real development, what we see is that that distinction doesn't really make sense. At every level, from the very beginning of development to the very end, and from social development to cognitive development to even straightforward biological development, what we see is a kind of constant interplay between nature and nurture. And that sounds kind of come by, oh yeah, it's a little of this and a little of that, but it isn't just that nature and nurture interact, it's that they can interact in very complicated and different kinds of ways. So what I'm going to do today is to give you a couple of examples of just how complicated the interactions between our genetic inheritance and our experience, nature and nurture, actually can turn out to be. And I want you to keep that in mind for the rest of the course as we're talking about development. And you should also keep it in mind as you read the New York Times or look on the web and see headlines that say things like that they've discovered a gene for X or they've discovered that Y is actually in the brain. So let me start out with an example that's extremely simple, not anything very fancy at all. And that is the case of PKU or phenylketonuria. Phenylketonuria. I always get that wrong. Okay, phenylketonuria. So what's phenylketonuria? Whenever a new baby's born, one of the very first things they do as soon as the baby's born is to take a little tiny sample of blood and test it to see whether the baby might have phenylketonuria or PKU. And phenylketonuria is actually a genetic condition, so you can detect it as soon as the babies are born. But it's actually a genetic condition which can lead to really terrible, severe mental retardation. So in the past, what happened was if you had this particular gene, it's a gene that means that you have a hard time digesting a particular amino acid, what happened is that you died at a young age and you suffered terrible mental retardation. So you think, okay, that's a pretty clear example of something that's genetic. You have the gene, you end up mentally retarded. You don't have the gene, you don't end up mentally retarded. But it turns out that it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. Because as I mentioned, the reason why phenylketonuria causes mental retardation is because it makes the body not able to metabolize certain kinds of substances that are in your food. And those substances become sort of poisonous and cause damage to the brain. So if you give children a diet that doesn't include any of those substances, if you're just very, very careful about what the babies eat, then babies don't end up having mental retardation. They do have phenylketonuria, but they don't actually suffer the effects of mental retardation. And that's the reason why we screen babies as soon as they're born to make sure to find out whether they're suffering from this genetic defect or not, because that means that then you can start the babies on a diet regime that will keep them from developing mental retardation. So this seems like a pretty straightforward case, but here's what's important about it. What's important about it is if you were to ask whether or how much mental retardation of phenylketonuria is caused by genetic genes or the environment, the answer wouldn't be, well, it's half genes and half the environment. The answer would be that it's 100% genes and it's 100% the environment. So if you have this genetic disorder, you won't ever get this particular kind of mental retardation unless you have this particular genetic disorder. So the genetic disorder is 100% responsible for the syndrome. But it is also true that if you're not in an environment in which these substances are in your diet, then you also won't get phenylketonuria. So it's completely determined by what your genes are like, and it's also completely determined by what your diet is like, what your environment is like. And there's an interesting point to make about this, which is that I think this is a particularly interesting case because if we were just say looking at non-human animals, then you would say this is a completely genetically determined syndrome. Because the thing that's distinctive about human beings is that we have the capacity to actually intervene and change the environment that we grow up in. So if we couldn't change our environment, then it would be true that your genes were 100% responsible for phenylketonuria. But the fact that we as human beings can find out about something like PKU, and we can actually intervene to change our environment, so now it's a different environment in which PKU won't lead to mental retardation, actually that's a kind of crucial thing that means that both nature and nurture are 100% responsible for this syndrome. And that's important because after all, what's characteristic of us as human beings is exactly the fact that we can get to change our own environment. So whenever someone says, yes, something's the result of something that's innate versus something that's there in the environment, what you should say to yourself is, well, that's this environment. What would happen if you had the same set of genes in a different environment? Suppose the environment was actually different. Let me give another example of this that is particularly relevant probably for people in this room. So sometimes people debate whether the fact that there aren't more women at the higher echelons of science is the result of something about women's genes or women's biology, or it's the result of something about the environment in which they grow up. And you may remember a couple of years ago, Lawrence Summers, who was the president of Harvard, said that it was the result of things about women's biology. So they didn't really have to do anything at Harvard to encourage more women to go into science. Now, if you think about that for a minute, that's a really good example of the fact that environments can change. So in the environment of the hunter-gatherers, right, there was no relationship between being a woman and being a scientist because there weren't any scientists. So nobody was a scientist. If you'd looked, you wouldn't have found any difference between women being scientists and men being scientists. If you'd looked 100 or 150 years ago in Europe, there would have been a 100% relationship between biologically being a female and succeeding in science or not because women weren't allowed to take science classes or be scientists, including my own mother, for example. So in that circumstance, there would be 100% predictability that if you were biologically a woman, then you would not be able to be successful as a scientist. In an environment 20 years from now, or in the environment in some Scandinavian countries where they've made a concerted effort to put girls in science classes, we see much greater participation of women in science. So in that environment, or in an environment in which women didn't have to choose between having babies and going into a profession, then you might see that difference between men and women in science completely disappear. So when we say that something's genetic or the result of genes or the result of the environment, it depends on what environment we're talking about. And since we're humans and we can change our environment, there's always the possibility that the genes are going to be expressed in a really different way in a different environment. Okay, let me give you a second example, still biological, but and still now not talking about women in science or anything complicated or anything like what we might think about with humans, just to show that the situation, the relationship between nature and nurture and the environment and the genes is even more complicated than we might think. So here's the example, and this is what I'll call the case of the faithful voles. One of the things so here's some bad news from biology. The bad news from biology is that there's no species that's sexually monogamous. So when you actually do DNA, and well, I guess bad news or good news depending on your point of view, but I will say that this is bad news. So even if you look at swans, at pigeons, at all the beautiful symbols of fidelity and metaphors and poems, it turns out that they fool around. So even swans fool around. But the good news is that many species, probably including us, engage in what biologists call social monogamy. That means that the pairs that mate with one another also spend time together, sing songs together, make nests together, raise the young together. Now that may seem obvious, but it's actually interesting that most species don't do that. So it's not that this is just naturally comes with mating. Most species, and certainly most species of mammals and primates, not only fool around sexually, but wouldn't even kind of get the concept because they don't form, males and females don't form bonds of any sort. They don't spend time together. They don't raise babies together and so forth. So that's true for most species of mammals. But it's not true for some. And an interesting question is, why is it that some animals show this kind of pair bonding and faithful interaction, and other animals don't? And obviously that's a really interesting question, and sometimes an urgent question if you're talking about human beings. But let's not talk about human beings. Let's just talk about voles. Voles are little mammals that look like this. And it turns out that voles are a kind of wonderful test case to answer this question because there are two different species of voles that are very closely related to one another, just slightly genetically different. The prairie voles and the montane voles. The prairie voles, as the name suggests, actually live on the prairies, and the montane voles live in the mountains. And these two types of animals are very similar, but they have very different mating patterns. So the prairie voles are like swans. They are cuddly, faithful, happy little creatures that spend all their time together and care for each other, and lick and kiss and cuddle. And the montane voles are basically horn dogs. So, the montane vole males go around and mate, or vice versa. The montane vole males and females mate with whoever's around. Okay. Why is there this difference in the way that they behave? Well, it turns out that difference is related to a couple of chemicals, a couple of hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. And we're going to hear some more about oxytocin and vasopressin later on in the class because they seem to play an important role even in humans in our attachment to one another, our ability to love one another. And it turns out that essentially what happens is that if you suppress these chemicals, so you keep the animals from, change the animals' genes so that those chemicals can't be taken up, and the prairie voles actually act like montane voles. So in other words, if you deprive the prairie voles of oxytocin, they don't receive any oxytocin, then they start acting like the montane voles. They don't engage in this kind of pair bonding. So you might think, okay, well, simple, oxytocin causes love. So if you just take enough oxytocin, then you kind of slip it into your boyfriend's drink, and you won't have anything to worry about. But unfortunately, it turns out that it's actually more complicated than that. Because on the other hand, if you give the chemicals to the montane voles, so you give the montane voles a bunch of oxytocin, and there's no difference. They don't become any more faithful. So there's something that's going on about oxytocin and vasopressin. Take away the oxytocin from the prairie voles, and they stop being faithful. But it isn't just as simple as that, because if you give the oxytocin to the montane voles, then they don't show any changes in their behavior. Well, it turns out that what happens is that the prairie voles have genetically determined receptors for oxytocin. So in other words, the prairie voles' brains are designed so that they're sensitive to the effects of oxytocin. So if oxytocin is there, then the prairie voles are more faithful, and if oxytocin isn't there, then the prairie voles act like the montane voles. And the montane voles, on the other hand, don't have these kind of receptors for oxytocin. And again, the things that you can do with voles that you can't do with humans, if you just change the montane voles' genes so that now they're like the prairie voles' genes, then the montane voles, if they get oxytocin, actually start behaving more faithfully. Okay. So what happens is there's a difference in the genes to begin with. There really is a difference in the genes. But what the difference in the genes does is it makes the animals differentially sensitive to the environment. So it's not just the prairie genes make the voles faithful and the montane genes make them promiscuous. It's that the prairie genes make them faithful if they get oxytocin. Okay. And it turns out that it's even more complicated than that. Because it turns out that it isn't just that genes cause you to produce oxytocin or not, but behavior actually makes you produce oxytocin. So in voles, when voles groom one another, when they sort of poke one another and engage in certain kinds of social interactions, they're more likely to produce oxytocin. And that turns out to actually be true in humans for kissing and hugging as well. So kissing and hugging is a good strategy if you want a happy, faithful relationship. More kissing and hugging. So kissing and hugging produces oxytocin. But now you can see that there's kind of a loop going on here, because you start out with these prairie voles that genetically are more sensitive to oxytocin, and the prairie voles also produce more of these behaviors that cause more oxytocin to be produced. So in the course of being pair bonded, what it means to be pair bonded is that the animals are spending a lot of time together and mutually grooming and interacting and behaving, and that's actually leading to more oxytocin production, and the oxytocin production is making them spend more time together and groom each other more. So there's a kind of benign cycle going on where the animals start out being more inclined to engage in this kind of pair bonding, but the very act of engaging in these kind of pair bonding behaviors makes the animals produce more oxytocin, and then that makes them produce more pair bonding. So there's really a kind of three-stage process that's going on here. It starts out with the voles being, it starts out with the voles having different kinds of genes, but then those genes lead to different productions of these chemicals and different uptake of the chemicals, and then the uptake of the chemical leads to different kinds of behaviors, and then the behaviors lead to changes in the chemicals. So the point here is that it's, as you might expect if you're talking about things like whether people are being faithful or not, it's complicated, right? So it's, even for voles, if you were going to put their relationship status up on Facebook, even for the prairie voles, the real relationship status you should have up is it's complicated. Let's have I mentioned last time that what we're going to do is have these explanation breaks in the class. So let's have an explanation break now. Why don't we start out for the first one, trying to figure out maybe the simplest thing to do is to go from the outside. So start out with the people on the outside of the rows, turning to the person next to them and explaining to them why it is that some vole species are more faithful than others. I talked about the idea behind this before, but trust me, studies show that this will actually make you remember this better and understand it better than if you don't. So just turn to the person next to you, take 5 minutes, and it'll be a good chance to meet the person next to you. Okay. This is sort of an experiment. That was 5 minutes. Do you think people could do it in 3 or 4? Would that be better, or 5? Any votes for 5? 5 minutes? 3 minutes? 3. Okay, so let's make it. We'll make it 3. And that looks great. People were waving their hands and they were nodding, and there was obviously real intense explanation going on there. And at some point in the course, I will tell you about my well-known but almost always miscited paper explanation as orgasm. And that you'll really appreciate that after several months of giving all these explanations in class. Okay. So let's think, here's yet another example of how complicated these interactions are between nature and nurture. So in the example of the voles that I just gave you before, we were talking about adult animals who are either getting certain kinds of environmental cues, like particular kinds of chemicals, or have a particular kind of genetics. It turns out that you see these effects even more strikingly in young animals. So you see interactions between nature and nurture taking place particularly intensely in very young animals. And this whole area of research, which is called epigenetics, has become a really major important development in biology and genetics over the past 10 or 15 years. And let me just give you one of the really beautiful classic examples of this. What this is all about is the fact that even when you have a particular set of genes, what really matters for the way that you behave, or for that matter, the way you are, is how those genes are expressed. And you should all know that from sort of basic biology. So you start out with a bunch of genes, but what really makes the difference to the proteins that you produce and ultimately the kind of creature and organism you are is how those genes are expressed. And the big discovery has been that the environment that you're in can make a big difference in the way that those genes are expressed. So in one environment, one set of genes can end up producing one set of behaviors. In another environment, the same set of genes can be expressed differently and produce a different set of behaviors. So let me give you this example that comes from Michael Meany, and Darlene Francis, who's here at Berkeley, was also involved in this work. And what they did was they started out with 2 different strains of mice. And one of the good things about doing experiments with mice is that you can make sure that all the mice have exactly the same genes. So these are 2 strains of mice. All the mice you know, because you've bred these mice, are absolutely identical genetically. And it turns out that when you do that, some of the mice are actually smarter than others of the mice. So some strains of mice, if you put them in a water maze, for example, will very rapidly figure out how to navigate the maze. And other strains of mice just flounder around and can't do anything in a maze. And these 2 strains of mice are like that. So there is what I will technically call the dumb mice and the smart mice. So there's the dumb strain of mice and the smart strain of mice. And that might seem to be a really good case for a strong genetic argument about a relationship between, say, genes and intelligence, or genes and IQ. What could be stronger? You have one bunch of mice with one set of genes and they're smart. You have another set of mice with another set of genes, they're dumb. Obviously, the genes are causing intelligence. But it turns out that mice also, like human beings, are engaged in mothering behaviors. This is a really cute slide of a mama mouse and these little tiny bare naked pink baby mice. Now, what the mama mice basically do is, which is perhaps not so recommended for humans, is they poke the babies. So they kind of bat the babies with their noses. So they have these kind of nose pokes that they do for the babies. But as far as the mice are concerned, a nose poke is as good as a kiss and a hug and a cuddle. It's a way of being in physical contact with the babies. So the moms stimulate the babies by producing these kind of nose pokes. So in the experiments that Meany and his colleagues did, and again, these are experiments you could do with mice rather than with that you couldn't do with humans. What they did was actually implant the embryos of one strain of mice, implant the embryos of the dumb strain into the wombs of the smart strain. So these are babies that are genetically from the dumb strain, but now, literally from before they're born, they're being raised in a smart mouse environment. And what they discovered was that when they implanted the dumb strain mouse in the smart mother, the mothers, because this is what smart mothers do, actually licked and groomed the babies more, and the babies grew up to be as smart as the smart mice did. So, in other words, it turned out that the difference between the dumb mice and the smart mice wasn't really a difference about their genetic inheritance, or it was, but the form the genetic inheritance was taking was that the dumb mice weren't getting as nurtured as the smart mice were. And when you took the dumb mice and you put them in a nurturing environment, as it were, then they turned out to do just as well at mazes when they grew up. Yeah?
So I'm a little confused because you're saying that both these mice are genetically identical. And that
the 2 strains are genetically different, but all the mice within each strain are genetically identical.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Thanks for getting me to clarify that. Yeah, so the 2 strains are genetically different, but within each group, all of the mice are genetically identical. Okay. Yeah? With the dumb mothers. I don't know whether they did that experiment or not, and I'm not quite sure what the outcomes would have been, but I can check and find out. Now, an interesting other thing about this was that if you did this later on in the baby's development, so if you just took the dumb mice and after they developed for a little while, and mice develop a lot faster than humans do, and then you gave them to the smart moms to raise, and the moms licked and groomed them, that didn't make a difference. So in other words, it wasn't just that the babies were getting more licking and grooming, it was that they were getting more licking and grooming from very, very, very early on in their development. Yeah? Good, great. I have a stooge in the audience. That's exactly the next point. So it turned out that, so the babies are all smart. Next slide. In fact, it turns out that then when you look at those babies who were fostered by the smart mice, when they themselves have babies, they produce more licking and grooming and poking behavior. So they're being more nurturing to their babies than the dumb mice mothers will. And there's actually a cross-generational effect. So then when you look at their babies are also smarter, are also like the original smart babies. Yeah? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So the 2 strains are not just differing in their intellect, but they're also different in how much nurturing they do of the babies. And it turns out that nurturing is really the thing that's making the difference to the babies growing up. But because you don't get these effects if you simply swap out the nurturing later on, it's something about what's happening in the baby's brains at this very, very early stage that seems to be the thing that's making the difference later. So it isn't just quite whether they get nurtured or not, it's whether they get nurtured in this very early developmental period.